The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. People whispered softly to each other, trying to guess what would happen next. Today was not an ordinary day. The case being heard was high profile, and the stakes were incredibly high. Journalists had crowded the back rows, cameras ready to capture every moment, while the public gallery was packed with people who had come out of curiosity and concern. Everyone could sense that something unusual was about to unfold. At the front of the courtroom sat the judge, a black jurist who was known for her fairness, intelligence, and calm demeanor. She had built a reputation over the years for being firm but just, and her presence alone commanded respect. She adjusted her robe and scanned the courtroom, her eyes calm but observant, making it clear that she was in complete control. Her reputation had preceded her, and people knew that any attempt to undermine her would be met with firm authority. As the court waited for the session to begin, the doors opened, and the detective entered. He was a man known for his boldness, sometimes crossing the line in his pursuit of cases. Today, however, he carried with him an air of arrogance. His shoulders were squared, his gaze confident, almost challenging. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people recognized him. Many had seen him in other cases, and while some respected his dedication, others had criticized his brash methods. Today, all eyes were on him. The detective strode to his place with an unusual sense of entitlement. He seemed to treat the courtroom as if it were his territory, rather than a place governed by rules and respect. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, drawing attention to himself. The judge watched silently, her calm expression unchanging, as if she could predict what was coming. The tension in the room thickened with each passing second. Lawyers shuffled their papers nervously, aware that the detective's reputation for confrontation often led to chaotic courtroom moments. The spectators leaned forward in their seats, trying to get a clear view of the unfolding scene. Cameras clicked, and reporters whispered to each other, speculating about what might happen if the detective crossed the line today. Every eye in the room seemed to hold a mixture of anticipation, fear, and curiosity. When the judge called the session to order, the detective didn't immediately respond in the typical respectful way. Instead, he seemed to deliberately ignore certain formalities, making subtle gestures and comments that drew the judge's attention. People could feel the tension rising, like a storm about to break. It was clear to everyone in the room that the detective had come with a specific intention, to challenge, to provoke, or perhaps to humiliate. Despite the detective's boldness, the judge remained composed. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't frown, and she didn't show any sign of irritation. Her calmness only seemed to heighten the tension, making the detective's actions appear even more reckless. The spectators could almost feel the power dynamic shifting. Every disrespectful glance or tone from the detective seemed to bounce off the judge, leaving him exposed and on edge. Outside the courtroom, the story of today's case had already begun circulating. Social media was buzzing with speculation, and the cameras inside hinted at how seriously people were watching. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next, and the room itself seemed to hold its breath. The tension wasn't just from the personalities inside the room, it was a mix of anticipation, respect, and fear of the unknown. The detective, noticing the attention, seemed to gain more confidence. He straightened his back, looked around the room, and whispered comments that were loud enough for some to hear. His goal was clear, to dominate the scene, to show that he was unafraid of the judge, and to make a statement in front of everyone. But what he didn't realize was that the courtroom had rules far stricter than he had ever faced, and the judge had a reputation for maintaining order no matter the challenge. As the session officially began, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Every word, every glance, every subtle movement from both the judge and the detective was noticed and interpreted by those present. It felt as if the entire courtroom was a chessboard, and the detective had just made a bold, risky move. The audience knew that one wrong step could completely change the dynamic of the case, and everyone silently waited to see what would happen next. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place for legal proceedings, it was a stage, with history, authority, and personalities clashing in real time. The air was thick with expectation, and every heartbeat seemed louder. People could sense that they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary, a moment that might soon go viral for its intensity and drama. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the tension hung like a heavy curtain, waiting to be lifted by the events about to unfold. The courtroom, still heavy with tension from the morning's proceedings, seemed to hold its breath as the detective made his move. Unlike the calm and measured approach that most officers took when presenting their statements, he approached the bench with a swagger that drew every eye in the room. He wasn't here simply to present facts. It was clear from the very beginning that he had something personal in mind, a challenge that went far beyond the case itself. He started with subtle jabs at the judge's rulings, phrasing them as questions, but delivering them with a sharpness that cut through the usual courtroom decorum. "Your Honor, are you certain about this procedure? It seems unusual," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. It wasn't just a question, it was a direct attempt to undermine the judge's authority. Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Lawyers shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The detective's words were carefully chosen, each one meant to provoke. He leaned slightly forward, pointing at documents in a way that seemed more theatrical than professional. He made insinuations about the judge's judgment, suggesting that mistakes had been made in prior cases, and did so with a smirk that only inflamed the tension further. His goal was clear: to humiliate, to dominate, and to make the judge doubt her own authority in front of everyone. But the judge, experienced and composed, did not react immediately. She allowed the comments to flow, letting the detective exhaust his energy and arrogance. Her calm, measured gaze swept across the room, meeting his eyes steadily. The courtroom sensed that this was not a simple clash of words, it was a test of power, and the judge's silence carried more weight than any verbal rebuttal. The detective seemed oblivious to the growing disapproval around him. Spectators whispered among themselves, journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and even the court staff exchanged uneasy glances. Every sarcastic remark from the detective was a deliberate attempt to dominate the narrative of the courtroom, to make the judge feel small in a space where she normally held absolute authority. Yet, the more he pressed, the more apparent it became that his tactics were failing. The calm, unwavering demeanor of the judge contrasted sharply with his restless energy, making him appear unprofessional and reckless. He continued, now raising his voice slightly, making statements that were not only disrespectful but personal. "It's hard to follow logic sometimes in these rulings, Your Honor," he said, a cruel twist of irony in his tone. The courtroom shivered at the audacity. It wasn't common for an officer to openly challenge a judge in such a manner, and the very act of speaking this way in a room filled with legal authority felt like stepping into dangerous territory. Even as he spoke, the judge's response remained calm. She did not flinch, did not interrupt, and did not display any sign of being shaken. This composure made the detective's insult seem even more hollow, highlighting the disconnect between his intentions and reality. The courtroom audience began to understand that the detective's attempt at humiliation was not just ineffective, it was exposing his own flaws and arrogance. As minutes passed, the tension became almost tangible. The detective's words grew bolder, his smirk more pronounced, and his gestures more dramatic. The people in the courtroom leaned forward, unable to look away. Some felt a strange mix of shock and anticipation, wondering if the judge would finally react, or if she would let the audacity continue. The entire scene felt surreal, like a high-stakes performance where every word had consequences beyond the immediate moment. At one point, the detective made a particularly sharp remark about the judge's credibility, aiming to provoke laughter from the audience. Instead, the courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. The air seemed heavier, as if the space itself disapproved of his disrespect. Even some of the detective's supporters shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the line between confidence and arrogance had been crossed. And yet, the judge remained steady, her eyes calm, her voice unraised, her posture regal. Every insult, every attempt at humiliation, bounced harmlessly off her composed exterior. The detective, blinded by his own ego, failed to notice the shift in energy. He was no longer in control. The audience could sense it, and even he would soon realize that the moment of reckoning was approaching. By the end of this tense exchange, it was clear that this was no ordinary confrontation. The detective had tried to humiliate the judge, to assert dominance in a place of law and order, but in doing so, he had set himself up for a dramatic fall. The courtroom, once buzzing with tension, was now charged with anticipation, waiting for the judge to reclaim control and restore the balance of authority. The courtroom, already tense from the detective's aggressive behavior, seemed to hold its breath as the exchange continued. People in the gallery shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding at the front. Spectators who had come expecting a routine legal proceeding were now witnessing something extraordinary, a clash of personalities, power, and authority that was far beyond ordinary courtroom drama. The detective's boldness had pushed boundaries, and the reaction of everyone present reflected just how unprecedented this moment was. Whispers spread like wildfire through the courtroom. "Did he just say that?" one woman murmured to her companion. "He can't possibly be serious," another voice replied. The murmurs grew louder, bouncing off the walls and creating a low hum of tension. Cameras in the back clicked rapidly, journalists scribbled frantically, and some people even raised their phones to record what was quickly becoming a viral-worthy confrontation. The room was no longer just a courtroom, it had transformed into a stage for an unfolding spectacle. The detective, still attempting to maintain control, seemed oblivious to the growing shock around him. He continued his verbal assault, smirking and pointing, leaning into his performance as if he were the star of a show. Every insult, every sneer, every dismissive gesture was meant to humiliate the judge in front of the audience. But the judge's calm, unshakable demeanor only made the detective appear more foolish. People in the courtroom began to notice the shift. The detective was no longer intimidating, he was exposing himself as arrogant, reckless, and out of line. Lawyers exchanged nervous glances. Some had never seen such blatant disrespect directed at the bench. They whispered softly to one another, concerned about the potential consequences of the detective's actions. Court staff, who were trained to maintain order, stiffened in anticipation, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. Even the bailiffs, usually calm and professional, seemed momentarily on edge, sensing that this confrontation could spiral out of control at any moment. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. Social media users, who had caught glimpses of the incident, began posting clips and commentary. The story spread rapidly, a detective publicly humiliating a black judge in a high-profile courtroom, and the judge remaining completely composed. People across the city, and soon the country, were captivated. Discussions erupted online about respect, authority, and the courage it took for the judge to maintain control in the face of blatant disrespect. The courtroom moment was fast becoming a symbol, sparking debates on justice, power, and the boundaries of professional conduct. Inside, the atmosphere grew almost electric. The audience, once quietly observing, was now leaning forward, their attention entirely consumed by the unfolding drama. Some spectators clutched the edges of their seats, unable to look away, while others covered their mouths in shock. The detective's every word, once commanding, now seemed to hang in the air awkwardly, each insult landing without the intended impact. It was as though the courtroom itself was responding, rejecting his attempts to assert dominance. Even the children in the gallery, who had come with their parents out of curiosity, sensed the gravity of the moment. Their wide eyes reflected a mixture of confusion and awe. They didn't fully understand the intricacies of the legal battle, but they could feel the tension, the power struggle, and the extraordinary authority the judge wielded simply by remaining calm. As the detective continued, the courtroom's collective shock transformed into a quiet respect for the judge. People began to see that the humiliation attempt was not just failing, it was revealing the detective's limitations. What was meant to intimidate had the opposite effect, it highlighted the judge's authority, poise, and mastery over the courtroom. The contrast between the detective's arrogance and the judge's composure was stark, and it resonated deeply with everyone watching. By the end of this tense exchange, the courtroom was silent, but it was a silence filled with awareness, awe, and anticipation. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen, a moment where authority would be clearly reasserted and justice would show its true face. The shock among the onlookers was not just at what the detective had done, it was at the power of the judge's restraint, the quiet yet undeniable control she had over the situation, and the anticipation of the dramatic moment that was about to follow. The spectators understood, instinctively, that they were witnessing history in a small but powerful way. This was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a lesson in dignity, authority, and the consequences of arrogance. The tension hung in the air, thick and unyielding, as everyone waited to see how the judge would respond, knowing that the next move could change everything. The courtroom had been holding its breath for what felt like an eternity. The detective's words had hung in the air like a storm cloud, sharp, tense, and aggressive. Everyone could feel the electricity in the room, the unspoken anticipation that something significant was about to happen. The murmurs among the spectators had died down, replaced by a heavy silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, waiting, wondering, how would she respond? The judge, seated at her bench, adjusted her robe in a small, deliberate motion. Her hands rested calmly on the surface in front of her, and her posture was straight but relaxed. There was no hint of tension on her face, no flicker of anger in her eyes. She radiated a quiet authority that filled the room even more powerfully than any raised voice could. The detective had entered the courtroom thinking he could provoke her, that his aggression could unbalance her, but he had underestimated her experience, her control, and her understanding of the law. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the detective's with a piercing clarity. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, and full of purpose. It was a gaze that did not just see the words or gestures, it saw the intent behind them, the arrogance and audacity that had led him to cross professional boundaries. In that moment, she didn't speak. She simply observed. Her silence was deliberate, measured, and more powerful than any immediate rebuke could have been. The courtroom felt the weight of it. Even the detective, though trying to maintain his bravado, felt the shift in energy. Her silence spoke volumes. The audience began to sense that this was not a typical exchange. The judge wasn't just listening, she was calculating, analyzing, and preparing a response that would assert her authority and restore the balance of respect in the room. Every subtle movement she made, tilting her head slightly, adjusting a pen, letting her eyes sweep the courtroom, added to the atmosphere of controlled power. The detective, whose aggression had been rising with every passing second, now felt a quiet pressure that was impossible to ignore. Then, after a deliberate pause, the judge finally spoke. Her voice was calm, firm, and clear, carrying effortlessly across the courtroom. It was the kind of voice that demanded attention without needing to shout, a voice that naturally commanded respect. She addressed the detective directly, her words measured but precise, exposing the absurdity of his behavior without a trace of anger. She reminded him of the rules, the boundaries of professional conduct, and the serious nature of his disrespect. Every sentence was a masterclass in authority, delivered without haste but with undeniable impact. The spectators leaned forward instinctively, as if trying to catch every nuance of her words. The courtroom reporters scribbled frantically, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would soon become headline news. The detective, meanwhile, realized that he had miscalculated. His usual tactics, intimidation, sarcasm, and mockery, had failed completely. The judge's calm response was not just a rebuttal, it was a demonstration of control, power, and dignity. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room judging him, measuring his audacity against her composed authority. What made the judge's response even more impactful was the contrast between her calmness and the detective's agitation. He had entered the courtroom thinking he would dominate, but now, he seemed smaller, almost fragile in his arrogance. Every whisper in the gallery seemed to echo the same thought: the detective had underestimated her, and the consequences of that misjudgment were becoming painfully clear. The courtroom itself seemed to react to her words. The heavy air of tension shifted, no longer just about anticipation but about recognition. Recognition that authority, respect, and professionalism were not given, they were earned and maintained through composure and courage. The judge's calm response had not only defended her own position, it had restored the courtroom's balance, reminding everyone present that law and order were not just abstract concepts but living principles enforced by those willing to uphold them with dignity. By the time the judge finished speaking, the detective was visibly unsettled. His gestures, once sharp and aggressive, faltered. His words, which had flowed with confidence, now hesitated, uncertain of how to proceed. The spectators, sensing the change in power dynamics, held their collective breath, realizing that the next moments would define the outcome of this confrontation. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for legal proceedings, it had become a stage for a lesson in authority, respect, and the quiet but unbreakable power of composure. In that moment, everyone understood the reality. The detective's humiliation attempt had failed spectacularly, and the judge's calm response had asserted a dominance far stronger than any shout, threat, or sarcastic remark could ever achieve. The scene was electric, charged with anticipation, as the audience waited to see what would come next. The calm had not ended the conflict, it had simply set the stage for a dramatic turning point, one that would leave an indelible mark on everyone in the room. The courtroom, which had been tense for hours, now seemed to hold its breath with a weight that could almost be felt. The detective, who had come in full of arrogance and bravado, had spent the morning trying, and failing, to humiliate the judge. His smirks, his sarcastic remarks, and his condescending tone had all been met with the judge's unwavering composure. Every attempt to dominate the courtroom had only highlighted his own recklessness. Now, a subtle shift began to ripple through the room, one that no one could ignore. The judge, still seated at her bench, paused for a moment. She looked over her glasses, her gaze calm but piercing, sweeping across the courtroom with a quiet intensity. Every person present felt the electricity in the air, as if time itself had slowed. Even the detective, who had been used to controlling every situation he entered, suddenly realized that the balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the center of attention in a position of dominance, he was under scrutiny, exposed in a way he had never experienced before. Then, in a voice that was both steady and commanding, the judge spoke a sentence that cut through the room like a bolt of lightning. She announced that the detective was to be arrested for contempt of court. The words were deliberate, measured, and precise, carrying with them the full weight of the law. Silence fell instantly. It was the kind of silence that made every person in the room pause mid-breath, the kind of silence that could only happen when the unexpected meets absolute authority. The detective's face went pale. For the first time, his confident demeanor faltered. His lips parted, as if searching for words, but none came. He had come in thinking he could intimidate, humiliate, and dominate. Instead, he found himself powerless, caught in the judge's carefully measured authority. The courtroom watched in awe as the man who had tried so hard to humiliate the judge now faced the consequences of his arrogance. Spectators leaned forward, holding their breath. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every moment, while journalists whispered urgently to one another, realizing they were witnessing a historic moment. The public gallery, filled with people who had come out of curiosity or concern, was completely silent, absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. It was rare for anyone, even a detective, to be held accountable so publicly, and rarer still for a judge to assert such control with quiet dignity rather than anger. The bailiffs, who had been standing quietly along the sides of the courtroom, immediately moved into action. They approached the detective with precision, their movements professional and calm. There was no chaos, no shouting, just a sense of order asserting itself over arrogance. The detective, for all his previous bluster, offered no resistance. He had no words, no arguments, no defenses left, just the realization that his behavior had finally crossed a line he could not come back from. The audience could feel the power of the moment. It was not just about one man being arrested, it was about justice, respect, and authority being upheld in a world where those principles are often challenged. The judge's calm decisiveness had transformed a tense confrontation into a teaching moment, one that showed the courtroom, and anyone watching, that power and privilege do not excuse misconduct. Even outside the courtroom, the scene began to ripple through social media and news outlets. Clips of the moment the judge commanded the arrest went viral almost instantly. People were shocked, impressed, and inspired by the judge's ability to maintain composure while asserting authority. Discussions erupted online about accountability, professionalism, and the importance of respect in positions of power. This was no longer just a local courtroom drama, it had become a symbol, a lesson, and a story that people would share for years to come. Back inside, the detective was being led away, still stunned, still silent. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, as if a tension that had been building for hours had finally found resolution. And yet, it was not a resolution born of anger or conflict, it was resolution through authority, calm, and the undeniable assertion of justice. The judge returned her attention to the courtroom, her posture unchanged, her voice ready to continue proceedings as if nothing had happened, yet everyone knew that something extraordinary had just occurred. The turning point had come. The detective's humiliation attempt had not only failed, but it had also resulted in a dramatic reversal of power. The courtroom had witnessed the fragile line between arrogance and accountability, and in that moment, silence had truly fallen, but it was the silence of awe, respect, and realization. Everyone knew that history had been made, and that the judge's calm, decisive action would be remembered far longer than the detective's moment of bluster ever could. The courtroom had barely recovered from the shock of the judge's command when the next act of this real-life drama began to unfold. The bailiffs, moving with quiet authority and precision, stepped forward. Their presence, calm yet firm, reinforced the power of the law in a way words alone never could. Every eye in the room followed them, watching as they approached the detective, who had moments ago been brimming with confidence and arrogance. Now, faced with the consequences of his actions, his bravado was gone, replaced by a stunned, almost helpless expression. The detective's steps faltered as he realized the severity of the moment. The courtroom, which had been tense and expectant, now felt electric with anticipation. Spectators held their breath, lawyers paused mid-motion, and journalists readied their cameras to capture history. This was no ordinary arrest. This was a public, undeniable demonstration of authority, respect, and the consequences of defiance. The detective, once seemingly untouchable in his self-assured arrogance, was now facing the full weight of accountability. The bailiffs reached the detective, and without unnecessary force or dramatics, they placed a firm hand on his shoulder. He attempted to resist verbally, muttering half-formed protests and excuses, but the room was deafeningly silent. There was no place for argument here, the judge had spoken, and her authority left no room for debate. Every movement of the bailiffs was deliberate and professional, a silent message to the audience that order would prevail, no matter the challenge. As he was led toward the courtroom exit, the detective's face betrayed a mix of disbelief and humiliation. The smirk that had once marked his arrogance was replaced with a pale, stunned expression. The public gallery reacted instinctively, gasps, murmurs, and whispered commentary filled the air. Some spectators shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered words of admiration for the judge, recognizing the extraordinary control she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Journalists scrambled to capture every angle of the moment. Cameras flashed, and the clicking of shutters echoed like a heartbeat through the room. Social media notifications began buzzing even before the detective left the building. Clips and photos circulated instantly, spreading the story far beyond the courtroom walls. People everywhere were witnessing the downfall of a man who had believed himself untouchable, taken down not by aggression or force, but by composure, authority, and the law itself. The detective's colleagues, sitting silently in the back of the courtroom, looked on in stunned silence. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to meet the gaze of someone they had respected. Others whispered softly, acknowledging the lesson being delivered in the most public and undeniable way possible. It was clear that this moment would be remembered, not just for the arrest itself, but for the dramatic reversal of power, the triumph of authority over arrogance, and the undeniable lesson in humility. Even the children in the gallery, who had been watching wide-eyed, sensed the gravity of the situation. Though they may not have fully understood all the legal details, they could feel the lesson: actions have consequences, and no one, no matter their rank or position, is above the law. The detective, once a symbol of unchecked confidence, had been humbled before an entire audience, and the lesson resonated throughout the room. By the time the detective was escorted out, the courtroom seemed to exhale as one entity. The tension that had built up for hours began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe and respect. People realized they had witnessed something rare, a powerful statement about justice, authority, and the consequences of arrogance. The judge's calm command had transformed the courtroom into a theater of accountability, a moment that would be replayed, discussed, and remembered for years to come. As the doors closed behind the detective, silence settled again over the courtroom. But this silence was different. It was no longer tense or anxious. It was filled with reflection, recognition, and respect for the authority that had been so masterfully wielded. The lesson was clear: true power does not need to shout, it does not need to intimidate, and it does not rely on aggression. True authority is calm, measured, and unshakable, and in that moment, the judge had shown it all. The moment the detective was escorted from the courtroom, the story didn't stay inside those walls, it exploded into the world. Phones clicked, cameras flashed, and reporters hurriedly began broadcasting the footage of the arrest. Social media accounts lit up within minutes. Clips of the detective's humiliation, the judge's calm command, and the swift arrest circulated like wildfire. Within hours, people across the city, and soon the country, were watching the viral courtroom drama unfold, captivated by the sheer intensity of the confrontation. Online, reactions poured in from every direction. Some viewers expressed shock at the detective's audacity, commenting on how boldly he had tried to humiliate the judge in front of the entire courtroom. Others admired the judge's unshakable composure, praising her ability to assert authority without losing calm. Memes, video edits, and commentary threads started appearing, each highlighting different aspects of the moment, from the detective's stunned expression to the judge's commanding presence. It was no longer just a legal proceeding, it had become a cultural moment, a lesson in authority, respect, and accountability that everyone wanted to see and discuss. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately. Headlines flashed across screens: Judge commands arrest after detective's humiliation attempt, courtroom drama turns viral, authority meets arrogance, and judge shows unmatched composure in viral courtroom moment. Journalists dissected the incident in live debates, analyzing the implications of the detective's behavior, the judge's response, and the larger issues of professionalism, respect, and accountability in positions of power. Experts weighed in, and legal commentators praised the judge's ability to restore order with calm authority rather than anger. In offices, homes, and social media forums, the public reacted with amazement. People debated the ethics of the detective's behavior, discussed the importance of judicial authority, and marveled at the dramatic yet controlled way the situation had unfolded. The story became a symbol for standing up against arrogance and showing that respect for law and procedure is non-negotiable. Educators and legal professionals even began using clips of the incident as examples in classrooms and seminars, illustrating how power, humility, and composure can decisively change the course of events. Meanwhile, discussions about race, respect, and authority began to surface. Many highlighted the significance of a black judge commanding such control in a courtroom historically dominated by hierarchical power structures. Social media users praised the judge not just for her professionalism, but for the quiet strength she displayed, sending a powerful message about equality, dignity, and justice in action. The courtroom moment had transformed into a lesson with global resonance, sparking conversations far beyond the city where it happened. The detective's colleagues and peers also reacted. Some expressed embarrassment, acknowledging that his behavior had crossed a line in the most public and undeniable way possible. Others debated the implications for his career, recognizing that the viral nature of the incident would follow him for years. In contrast, praise for the judge surged, with many lauding her composure as a masterclass in authority, strategy, and dignity. It was clear that the balance of public opinion had decisively shifted in her favor. Back in the courtroom, the ripple effects of the arrest were still palpable. Lawyers, spectators, and staff who had witnessed the event firsthand exchanged glances, nodding silently to each other. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary. What started as an ordinary legal proceeding had become a defining moment, not just in their careers or lives, but in the ongoing conversation about respect, accountability, and justice. By the end of the day, the incident had transcended its immediate context. The courtroom drama had gone viral, creating a narrative that people everywhere could relate to, a story of arrogance confronted with authority, of composure winning over chaos, and of justice prevailing in a way that was both dramatic and profoundly educational. The public reaction was a testament to the power of courage, control, and fairness, and it ensured that the story would not be forgotten anytime soon. The courtroom, once a place of tension and confrontation, had finally returned to a calm that felt almost reverent. The events of the day, the detective's humiliation attempt, the judge's unwavering composure, and the dramatic arrest, had left everyone present forever changed. For many, it was more than a legal proceeding, it was a powerful lesson in authority, respect, and the consequences of arrogance. The echoes of what had happened would resonate long after the courtroom emptied, carried in conversations, social media posts, and news headlines. In the quiet that followed, people began to reflect on the extraordinary sequence of events. The judge had not raised her voice, she had not displayed anger or aggression, and yet she had commanded the room with an authority that no shout could match. Her decision to have the detective arrested was not an act of revenge, it was an assertion of justice, fairness, and the rules that govern the courtroom. This had reminded everyone watching that authority is not about dominance or intimidation, it is about integrity, composure, and the courage to enforce accountability when it is needed most. The detective, whose arrogance had once seemed untouchable, now faced the consequences of his behavior. His humiliation, both in the courtroom and in the eyes of the public, served as a stark reminder that no one is above the law. The arrest had not only restored the balance of authority within the courtroom but had also sent a clear message to anyone who might think that disrespect or intimidation could go unchallenged. The courtroom, once charged with tension, now felt like a space where justice had truly been served, in both the literal and moral sense. Outside the courtroom, the story continued to ripple across the world. Social media, news channels, and public discussions all reflected a shared recognition of the judge's extraordinary professionalism. People admired her ability to transform a moment of potential chaos into a lesson in dignity and fairness. The incident had become more than just a viral story, it had become a symbol of how calm authority, grounded in knowledge and integrity, can triumph over aggression, arrogance, and disrespect. For the spectators who had been present, the experience was unforgettable. They had witnessed history in the making, a moment where a single individual's courage and composure had reshaped the dynamics of power in a room full of authority figures. Teachers, students, lawyers, and ordinary citizens all found lessons in the events, that respect must be earned, that arrogance can lead to downfall, and that justice is strongest when paired with calm, principled action. Even the broader public, thousands of miles away from the courtroom, recognized the impact of what had happened. The story sparked discussions about accountability, professional ethics, and the importance of maintaining composure under pressure. Many saw it as a lesson not only for those in the legal profession but for society as a whole, proof that integrity and respect are never outdated values and that courage is sometimes quiet, deliberate, and powerful. By the end of the day, the courtroom drama had transformed into a story of justice and triumph. The judge's calm authority had restored order, the detective had learned the consequences of his actions, and the public had been given a vivid lesson in accountability and respect. What began as a tense confrontation had evolved into an enduring tale of principle over arrogance, fairness over intimidation, and dignity over hubris. The lesson was clear: true power is not loud, reckless, or domineering. It is composed, confident, and principled. And in that extraordinary courtroom, the judge had demonstrated it in a way that would be remembered, discussed, and celebrated for years to come. Justice had prevailed, not through anger, not through spectacle, but through calm, unwavering authority, leaving a legacy far greater than any single courtroom could contain.